Welcome to Chapter 11, Identity, the Self, Gender, and Moral Development. In this chapter, there will be a total of 5 videos covering, covering these 5 learning questions. You can read these over for yourself. So there'll be one video for each major section of Chapter 11. We're going to start in this first video by looking at the development of the self-concept. And first of all, an individual's self-concept is certainly affected by whether they grow up in more of an individualistic culture or a collectivist culture. So I have mentioned these terms before. Remember, the U.S. is very much an individualistic culture where we promote the individual and individual rights and freedoms, and we encourage uniqueness among individuals, and do your own thing and let your freak flag fly and all that kind of stuff. And whereas in a collectivist culture, it's more about finding your place in society, and it's more centered on group processes. So the family unit as a group, and the peer unit, and the work unit, and the class unit. I mean, like, where you're not supposed to try to stand out. You're brought up very differently to think of the group first, and how you fit into it, rather than trying to be unique. So when we think about self-concept, I wanted to point out these examples here from these were self-descriptions by an American child and a Chinese child. So let's look at the American child first. He says, "I am a wonderful and very smart person, a funny and hilarious person, a kind and caring person, a good grade person who is going to go to a prestigious university, a helpful and cooperative girl." And you can see that the emphasis here is really on personal aspects of this child's life. It has very positive evaluations of the self, and it lists a lot of traits and abilities that this person has. Whereas the Chinese child says, "I'm a human being. I'm a child. I like to play cards. I'm my mom and dad's child. My grandma and," okay, it's messed up there, "my grandma and grandpa's grandson. I'm a hardworking, good child." So here you see, more connections mentioned in the self-description. I mean, they're bringing in the fact that they're connected to their parents, that they're their child, they're connected to their grandparents. Not a lot of individual traits or abilities mentioned. More of an emphasis on the social aspects of their lives and how they fit in with others. And this is very typical what we see when we compare descriptions among children from individualistic versus collectivist cultures. You really develop a different self-concept depending on the culture that you're brought up in. So let's look at the development of self-concept. And we'll begin with infancy, and where there is a confusion of self and other. Margaret Mailer is mentioned in your textbook, and her last name's spelled Mahler. And Margaret Mailer says that during the first year of life, she calls it that their self-concept is the I concept. They have a sense of I, and she says that infants are not born with a sense of self that's separate from those who take care of them. but they start to begin to understand the self a little bit based on their growing ability to make things happen. So throughout the first year, an infant will learn to, you know, grab things or push things or make or drop things and make things happen. And so she says that they develop, a partial sense of self, which she calls the I self. In the second year of life, they develop a new sense of self-awareness when they can begin to think about themselves. In the first year, they just know that they can make things happen. It's like, I can do this. I can drop something. I can pick something up. But it's not till, the second year that they start to develop the me sense, which is what she calls the me sense of self, where you can think about, I'm an individual. This is me, and there are four ways that in which this new sense of self is expressed, and we're going to go through, four, and they're all kind of related, and they tend to, you know, all occur around the same time period. What kind of one follows the other, and so we'll go through four ways in which the developing sense of self of you know it starts to show up in the second year of life. The first way is mere self recognition. Um, and mere self recognition is whether or not a child can recognize themselves in a mirror. And the way that they test this is that they will, place a little red smudge, like, some coloring, either on the child's nose or on their forehead, and then they place them in front of a full length mirror, and so they can see themselves. And if the child recognizes themselves, they will typically, touch their forehead or their nose, like wherever the red smudge is. And that if they do that, if they look at themselves in the mirror and then touch their forehead or their nose, I mean, this shows that they recognize that that's them in the mirror, and so they're reaching to find out what that red smudge is. Um, if they don't recognize themselves, they may do things like talk to the child in the mirror. I've seen children like go and look behind the mirror to see if there's a person there. So, anyways, this is called the Rouge test. It's a little red dot that you put on them. And this is something that is affected by culture. In Western society, like in the U.S., for instance, children tend to recognize themselves somewhere between 18 and 24 months. So between a year and a half and 2 years of age, they start to recognize themselves in the mirror. In collectivist cultures, it tends to be somewhat later. And hopefully that should make sense to you. I mean, we are teaching our children from the start to be individuals, and we're focused on them as individuals. So it's not surprising that they learn to recognize themselves quicker than in a collectivist culture where it's not focused on the individual, during the upbringing. So a year and a half to 2 year is when you see that. The second way in which you see the expression of sense of self is by the use of pronouns. So typically after a child starts talking, they often go through a phase of using incorrect pronouns. So like when they want to be picked up, this child is saying, "Daddy, pick you up," but really, like they're asking to be picked up, but they use you instead of me, instead of pick me up. Or they might use their name and say something like, pick Kevin up, But what you don't tend to see early on is them use the word me, and until they have a sense of self, then they start to switch and use me versus you correctly. And they start to use I and me terms, and instead of always saying you. This is linked with the mirror self-recognition. So it's typically, once children start to recognize themselves in the mirror, they also start to then use the correct pronouns, and then start to say I or me instead of you. So this, once again, we expect this to happen between 18 to 24 months, just like the mirror self-recognition. Okay. Third is visual perspective taking, the ability to see from another person's point of view. And once again, it's around 18 to 24 months that children start to be able to take other people's points of view. This is linked with the last development. Once they start to use I and me instead of you, and they start using pronouns correctly, then we typically see them being able to take other people's perspectives. If they're not using I versus you correctly, then they probably won't get to this, stage at that point. So, these things kind of follow one another. They start to recognize themselves in mirrors, and they start to use I and me instead of saying you all the time. Then once they start using I and me, it shows that they're starting to understand that they're a separate person, and then they can start taking other people's perspectives. In a wait, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. Okay, a researcher named Cooley says that we develop what he calls a looking glass self, which is our sense of it's our sense of who we are is largely a reflection of how others see us. So once you begin to be able to, once a child begins to be able to take other people's perspective, then they start to develop Cooley's looking glass self idea, because then they can start to see themselves from how others describe them, or how others see them. But you can't, once again, you can't develop the looking glass self if you're not able to take other people's perspectives. So once again, one thing's following another. Perspective taking ability is also linked with culture, as it says here. In this case, it works a little differently. A child in a collectivist culture where they value interdependence, among people, they typically have a greater ability to take other people's perspectives. So it sometimes this aspect develops a little sooner in a collectivist culture, because if you're taught about connections between you and others, and how you fit in with others, I mean, this helps with visual perspective taking. Okay, so going on here, possessiveness is the fourth way that their developing sense of self shows up. And so this is another component of their growing sense of self. And they start using the word mine in order to claim things. So like, for instance, to claim a toy, they will say mine. And this shows an understanding of the self as being different than others. This is also linked to the ability to self-recognize in a mirror. If they haven't passed that step, then they're typically not using the word mine to claim things. So, I mean, this, and once again, so this is 18 to 24 months again. So this is, there's 4 different ways that it shows up, usually between a year and a half, 2 years, that they're starting to recognize themselves as an individual. And so they start to use I instead of you. They start to use mine. They can recognize themselves in the mirror. They can take other people's perspectives because they realize that they're different from others. Okay. This is, I'm going to be bringing in Erik Erikson's stages. from his psychosocial theory at various parts throughout this chapter, and so this is happening during Erik Erikson's second stage. Um, in an earlier chapter, I talked a little bit about his first stage from during the first year of life, where a child learns trust versus mistrust, and his second stage is from 1 to 3 years of age. So this is right, it's his stage is like right when the child's developing a sense of self, and his second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So autonomy is all about being independent and separate from others. So this kind of Erikson's, the stage, what he highlighted as the importance of this time period from 1 to 3 is what we're seeing in all this evidence here, that a child is developing autonomy. They're developing a sense of self, that's distinct from others. Okay. It, I will, just to expand on that a little bit further. I mean, the autonomy also refers to the child being able to do things on their own. So things like potty training becomes very important to them. Feeding themselves, putting their own clothes on, you know, because they couldn't do anything for themselves during the first year. Then from 1 to 3, as they gain abilities and they want to start to do things for themselves. And that also represents their developing autonomy. But it's also about recognizing that they're distinct beings, and they're different from others. It must be a weird, it's even weird to talk about it, but that we start off in life not realizing that we're separate from others, not realizing that we have, that we're a separate, you know, alive being, with our own thoughts and our own mind. And, I mean, it it's a pretty, when you think about it, we take it for granted because we all know that we're separate from others, but it is a pretty complicated kind of idea. So this is why it takes up to a couple of years before the child develops the knowledge that they're distinct from others, that they have their own wants and desires and ideas. And okay, let's go on. So this is just looking at the first couple of years of life. Now we're going to move on to preschoolers. And during preschool years, the sense of self is very concrete. It's usually about what they do, certain activities or skills that they might do, what they have, like things that they own, or what they look like. They might use some simple descriptors, that describe their personality a little bit, like good or bad or mean or nice, or but really there's not too much internalized description. It's mainly I can do this, I have this. And I'll just give you an example here. So a preschooler might say, I'm 3 years old, I live in a big house, I have blue eyes, I have an orange kitty, I know my ABCs, I can run fast, I can count to 100, I'm a good climber, etc. So it might be kind of like a list of things they can do, things that they own, how they look, and that is a fairly simple description like that. Preschoolers certainly do overestimate their abilities, and I find this hilarious. Like, and if you've been around preschoolers enough, you may be able to think of some examples, but they often think that they can do something just because they want to, or if they can think of it, then they can do it. So like a preschooler might walk up to a boulder that's as big as they are, that even an adult couldn't lift, and think that they can lift it. I mean, they've just no concept, because if they think about lifting it, like let's say you say something like, well, this boulder's in my way, it'd be good if we could move it over there or something. I mean, they'll just go up and they'll like strain against it and try to lift it. I mean, so and, with the belief that they can do it. So I mean, they have wild beliefs about their abilities. They rarely say, "Oh, I can't do this" or "I can't do that." Okay. We reach Erickson's next stage during preschool years from 3 to 5 years of age. His third stage is initiative versus guilt. Preschoolers try to initiate activity. They want to do things, to create things, to make things happen. When they fail, they may feel guilty that they've done something wrong, especially if their parents are impatient with their failed attempts. What you'll see is during preschool years, preschoolers want to make some choices, like I said, they want to make things happen, um, which some will often involve like perhaps pushing against certain rules. Like if you tell a preschooler, I don't want you to go past this line in the backyard. I mean, they're gonna go right up to that line at some point and dip their toe across it or just kind of jump across it and then jump back, or because they want to they want to be in control. They don't they when they were young. I mean, like remember once again in the first year everything was done for them, and then when they're a toddler, I mean they basically have to follow every instruction that's given to them, and so a preschooler they start to push back a little bit. Like I want to wear the yellow shirt. I don't like that purple shirt. I want to wear the yellow shirt. I mean, these kind of arguments happen in the preschool years, and this is a sign of initiative. They want to make a choice for themselves, whether it's what they're wearing or like what they're allowed to do, and so when I say that they push against rules, I mean it's not in a devious way but they want to sometimes just find out, well, what happened? You said I can't do this. What happens if I do it? Or you know, so this is once again the development of initiative, and as I said a little bit earlier, if they fail at things, and if they're criticized by their parents, or their parents are really impatient with them when they try something and fail, then this is where the guilt can come in, and they can start to carry it around. So like a preschooler might decide for the first time ever to pour their own glass of milk, and then they end up slopping it all over, right? So they start pouring it, they don't know how to do it right, and the cup falls over and spills. I mean, like if the parent comes in and chews out this child, I mean, like no wonder they feel guilty. They were just trying to show initiative. They were just trying to make a decision. I can do this for myself, and so you really need patience with preschoolers, even though they can you know be aggravating at times or push against your rules at times. I mean, but this is part of their development of who they are, and feeling like they can um, make choices for themselves and choose to pour their own milk. Okay, so once again, that was 3 to 5 years of age, that stage. So let's talk a little bit more about the self in preschoolers. Uh, Autobiographical memory is very important for a sense of self. It develops in the preschool years. Creating a sense of self is continuous over time. So your autobiographical memory is a coherent set of memories about your life. If you look back at your life, you know, you can go back to a certain age in childhood and kind of, talk about year after year, certain things that happened. And I went to this school, and then in public school, I was in this school, and then grade 7A, I went to this other school, and then in high school, I went to we have like a set of memories that helps to define who we are and our path in life. And so this is really important. So as the preschooler develops more of an autobiographical memory in this, you can start to kind of look back at what they were doing last month, or what maybe if they can remember what they were doing last year and how they're different. And then they can see their own development, and they can grow from the changes that they go through year after year. Um, and it gives them a more continuous sense of self, and how they've changed from one year to another. So it shows up in little ways. The child might say something like, oh, I liked um, what was that show? I liked what was that pony show? I don't know why I'm thinking of that one, but I like that last. I'm thinking of some cartoon. I like that last year, but I don't like that anymore. Or like, and that would show that they have a memory from like liking it at some earlier time, and that they've changed. And this is what autobiographical memory allows for you. That you can see, how am I different from an earlier time? Okay. Parents can certainly help children's development of autobiographical memory if they just discuss events in the child's life with them. Um, so just as example, like if you take a preschooler on a trip to the zoo, for instance, and you think it's pretty special and you want them to remember it, you should really make sure you discuss it with them later. If you don't talk about it all, you take them to the zoo, they have a good time. I mean, it's going to be much harder for them to remember it. You have to kind of activate the memory a little bit after it. So, what did you like at the zoo? What was your favorite animal? I mean, did you have fun when you did this or that? And what did you think about the elephant? Was it big? And anyway, so you ask them some questions, you talk about the experience, and that helps to solidify that memory for them. Um, and it's just a very good policy for parents or caregivers to do with children to help them, form these autobiographical memories, especially for important events. Um, okay, moving on. Let's go to school-age children. Um, so inner states become more of a part of their sense of self now. So, not in any complex psychological way, but they will talk about things like what makes them sad or what makes them mad, like, so they have a recognition of some of their internal emotions and what might cause them. Like, I'm really happy whenever mommy comes to pick me up at the daycare, and I feel sad though after she drops me off and leaves. And I mean, so they can talk about some of their internal emotions now, rather than just like in the earlier time where they basically talked about what they looked like, or what they owned. Um, Social comparison places them in the context of their peers. They now in elementary school they'll start to rate their abilities versus their peers, and it doesn't really start before elementary school, because a preschooler just doesn't have the ability for social comparisons, the mental ability. I mean, it may not seem hard to you, but in order to compare yourself to others, you have to be able to coordinate two or more concepts at the same time, in your working memory. And younger children just simply cannot do that adequately. They can't like think about how fast of a runner Johnny is, and think about how fast they are at the same time, and then do a comparison. I mean, that's just too many parts. Their thought processes aren't quite up to that yet. So there's a good reason why social comparison starts in elementary school. So it's not just because, well, now they have classmates, and um, I mean, there's certainly kids um, in preschool years that go to preschools or daycares, or whatever, and so it's not like they're not around peers, but they just don't have the mental ability until elementary school. Um, okay, the self-concept becomes more realistic than at younger ages. So now they know they can't lift that big boulder. They know things like they're not happy all the time. Like maybe a preschooler would say, "I'm always happy" or something. So they just more realistic. They know that, for instance, their internal emotions will change from one time to another. Um, the Erickson's next stage is here, his fourth stage. It's industry versus inferiority. This is from 6 years until puberty. And industry is about understanding what you can do, like what you're good at. So, children are going to school in order to prepare for, eventually to prepare for their adult life. And so in school, when they start to do these social comparisons, they learn what they're good at or what they're not so great at. Um, and having a sense of industry is feeling like there's certain things I can do, or there's certain things I can do well. I'm a fast runner, that can create a sense of industry. Or I'm a really good speller, or I'm I'm better at adding numbers than a lot of my classmates. So you see what you're better at than others, and this gives you a sense of industry that you can accomplish things. Inferiority comes from a child believing that there's nothing that they're good at, that they're behind and everything. And there may be, some rational reasons for that at times where, let's say, a child with some severe disabilities, for instance, or whether physical disabilities or mental disabilities. I mean, like they may have trouble, develop more trouble developing a sense of industry that they're, that they're really good at things. But I would say most of the time, when people have the negative outcome of an inferiority complex, it usually comes from others convincing them that they're not good at anything. Because really, basically, any child's good at something. Even if it's just, I don't know, twisting your tongue in a knot or whatever. I mean, like it could be tap dancing for one person. It could be like just counting for another person. I mean, like everyone, somebody knows how to snap their fingers. I mean, whatever. We all find things that, hey, I'm pretty good at this. Um, there was a guy I went to school with, and he was very proud. And this was in elementary school. He was very proud of how far he could spit. I mean, that was his thing. No one wanted to be on his bad side because he might actually spit at you, and you could spit really far. So, anyways, I know that's a little gross, but I just, like I said, like we all find something. Anyways, so the inferiority usually comes when somebody is convinced. They've maybe heard it. Typically, it would come from home. Perhaps they're always put down. They're nothing they do is valued, um, and so a child may become convinced that they're behind at everything, that they're not very good at anything. And there's also sometimes teachers can contribute to that message as well. And this is the time where you may develop a child may develop an inferiority complex that they carry with them as part of their personality and carry it, into adolescence and adulthood. Okay, moving to adolescence. The physical, cognitive, and social changes that occur during adolescence are reflected in changes in the self-concept. So their self-descriptions during this age become more abstract, and they contain more psychological attributes now. They also do things like they might include contradictory traits, where like the adolescent talks about how they're friendly and outgoing when they're with their peer group, but they're really shy when they're with adults. So like, that they can be two different ways. They can be outgoing in one situation, shy in another. And younger children don't recognize that kind of dichotomy and that complexity. Adolescents start to realize that they have a shifting sense of self. They're not always the same. They're different in different circumstances. Um, okay. Um, Erickson's fifth stage happens during adolescence. It's called identity versus role confusion, and this is about. Oh, officially, we're just going to say this is from 10 to 20 years of age. Um, Although it doesn't, the development of identity by no means has to finish by the age of 20, but it should at least be started during adolescence. Um, and development of identity is about figuring out who you are, and not only who you are, but who you want to be. Where are you heading in life? Um, Erickson talks about how it's very typical to see adolescents experiment with new identities. So they might, go through phases where they dress very differently. So an adolescent might go through a goth phase and dress all in black, and then maybe they go through a new wave phase and do their hair differently, put purple streaks in it or whatever. I mean, like, and then they might go through a phase where they, I don't know, where they try to be really organized and tidy, and then they go through a messy stage, and they might switch friendships and from one week to another, or they might switch peer groups. So there, and this is what you should expect. I mean, it's kind of like figuring out, where do I belong? What kind of life am I going to live? Do I want, how do I want to be with others? Do I want to be more outgoing? Do I want to be more shy? Or how what's my style going to be? How am I going to dress? And how am I going to look to others? And and then, like, it's all, and there's also obviously a much more complex aspects of it as well, like figuring out things like your sexual identity and your gender identity, and you might work on your religious identity, and what do you believe? How is it the same as your parents, or is it different? Um, so Erickson talks about that adolescents will develop either a positive or a negative identity, and most adolescents eventually settle on a positive identity, which just means that it's one that's approved of by society. But occasionally, some adolescents, they develop a negative identity, one that parents or other adults would not approve of, and they know that it's not approved of, but this is their identity. So, like, if you were to choose during adolescence to become a druggie, for instance, this is, I know my parents hate drugs. I can never let them know I smoke the drugs, or that I sell drugs, or whatever you might be doing. Like, I mean, some people choose that. They know it's not approved of. They know it's not acceptable to others, but occasionally it's part of their identity exploration to actually go on a negative, in a negative pathway, and to choose a negative identity. A lot of times it's oppositional. It's like, I am not you. I'm not the same as my parents, so I'm going to do something that they would never do. Um, Erickson says that before an adolescent can achieve an identity, they must engage in a period of active exploration. They actively explore their alternatives, and then they have to make a personal commitment to the choice that they make. So there's two major aspects there, that they to achieve an identity, you have to actively explore, which is like trying out different things, and um, trying to learn about different choices, and then you have to, eventually you have to personally commit to one choice over another. And so, a researcher, Canadian researcher named James Marcia, Marcia, he took this idea, of that you have to actively explore alternatives and you have to make a personal commitment. He took those two variables and, put them in a chart like this, and came up with four, what's called identity statuses. Okay, I know it doesn't say that anywhere here, but these four things in this chart are called identity statuses, and so you can see it's based on two variables. Along the at the very top, you can see crisis, That's the exploration variable. Like, has this person explored alternatives? Are they actively thinking about, their identity and who they want to be or who they are? The commitment is, have they made a choice? You see that on the left. So, have they personally committed to a choice yet? And then based on the answers, like whether it's high or low, or you can think of it as yes or no almost, but you come up with these four statuses. So I'm going to go over them. And the first one is called identity diffusion. So you see that crisis or exploration is low, commitment is low. So this person has not started to explore their identity, and they haven't made any choices about their identity. Um, so this is and they may not even be concerned about the whole issue. So like this would be perfectly reasonable, let's say for a 12-year-old, I mean, like, or a 13-year-old. I mean, there's even my daughter's 14. She hasn't, put a lot of thought into what she's going to do in life, or, where she's heading necessarily. So like, it's very typical for younger adolescents to be diffused, meaning that they haven't really started the process of identity development. Now, if you're like, uh, let's say a 28-year-old and you're still identity diffused, well, that's a very negative state. So it, it that would be like somebody who just has no goals in life. They have no leadership skills. They don't really make choices for themselves. They're probably followers of others. They may live at home in their mother's basement and get high and play video games all day. I mean, and that's kind of like their life, and they're not even aspiring to anything. Like a diffused adult is somebody that's just going nowhere, and they're not even trying to go anywhere. Um, so it's good. It's a perfectly fine state if you're young, but as you get older, you don't want to be in that identity diffusion state. Okay, the next one is foreclosure, identity foreclosure. So you can see in this case, exploration is low, meaning that they haven't thought about the important issues of who they are and where they're heading in life, but their commitment is high. They've committed to some choice. So that's an unusual kind of combination. They haven't explored alternatives, but they've actually committed to a direction. Well, foreclosure is happens when the individual is willing to accept an identity that someone else has chosen for them. So imagine that you've grown up in a family where you've heard since you were a kid that, your grandfather's a doctor and your father's a doctor, and we can't wait till you're going to be a doctor, and then, like, they start telling you which school you're going to go to, and they tell you, like, what volunteer activities to go to do in your adolescence to get ready to build up your resume, and anyway, it's like, somebody else is kind of pulling the strings and choosing your direction. You're going to be going to medical school. You're going to become a doctor. You're going to do this and that. And if the individual just accepts what's being handed to them, then they're in identity foreclosure. They didn't make the choice themselves, but they're committed to an identity that was chosen for them. This is People that are foreclosed are the most likely candidates to have a midlife crisis. I mean, they may end up pursuing and following a career that wasn't of their choosing. So all of a sudden they get to middle adulthood. It's like, I never wanted to be a doctor. Or I never wanted to do this choice that my parents, picked for me. And I always wanted to be a drummer or whatever. And so, like, this is what might cause a midlife crisis. Um, okay. Going on, identity moratorium. Um, the exploration is high. They're considering alternatives, but commitment is low. They haven't made a choice yet. A very reasonable stage. This is the stage that most people go through before they reach achievement. So a person in the moratorium status is actively exploring alternatives for their future identity, but they have not yet been ready to make a commitment. And so it's a good state. I mean, like, they're on their way. They're testing things out. They're finding out information. They're comparing choices. And then when they finally do commit, and say, okay, I've decided this is what I want to major in, or this is the school I want to go to, or whatever the big choices that they're trying to commit to. Then they can reach identity achievement. Means that they have gone through the active search process for an identity, and now they're fully ready to commit to one. I've decided I'm going to go to this school and become a doctor or whatever. Okay, so these are called identity statuses. Okay, I'm going to go through the next couple slides quickly. I don't want to spend too much time in adolescence, but identity development occurs in many different domains. I kind of sometimes when I talk about it, I might just talk about it like it's one thing. Do you have an identity or not? But really it has like a multitude of components that make up your identity. And I kind of mentioned some of them earlier. So like you have gender identity, you have a religious identity, you have a career identity, you have a sexual identity, you have a political identity, etc. So there are many aspects to the overall identity that person has, and we don't work on all of them at once. I mean, it's very common that you may be well into adulthood and never really stop to think much about, I don't know, maybe your religious beliefs, or you haven't stopped to think about your political beliefs too much, or something. So at some of these components might come later. What we value in the U.S. Above all else is career identity. I mean, this is what we kind of push our adolescents towards, that they have to figure out what kind of work they want to do. Like, what are they going to college? Where are they going to go? What are they going to major in? And this, we kind of see this in our society as the major part of identity that needs to be explored and committed to at some point. Whereas we don't care as much if our adolescents aren't political, or we might not care whether or not they're really religious or not. I mean, it. Anyways, people are likely to change at least some aspects of their identity throughout adult life. Significant life events such as the birth of a child, a divorce, or a change in health could result in a need to reevaluate identity. So keep in mind, it's not set in stone. You don't achieve identity and then that's it for the rest of your life. You often slip back into moratorium, and it's called the MAMA sequence, MAMA. Like you go from moratorium, then you achieve identity, then like something happens in life at some point, and you kind of go back to moratorium where you start to reevaluate. Oh, hey, I might change my mind about this, or like you go through a divorce, or you're reevaluating, what kind of relationship you're going to have. Right? You might reevaluate whether you want kids or not. Like you might, something changes in your job, you reevaluate your career. So people throughout life, you go from moratorium to achievement, for some length of time, and then you can easily slip back to moratorium when things change, and then you go into an achievement stage again, and that's very typical. So achievement's not set in stone. Finally, rites of passage. These are rituals that publicly mark a change in status from child to adult. So these are important parts of identity for those that are in groups that promote and those that experience these rites of passage. These are very important markers that they've reached a new status in their identity achievement, and so we see a few examples here. I don't remember what culture this tooth filing ceremonies from, but quinceanera, I probably don't pronounce it right, but that happens at the 15th birthday for certain people in the certain Latina adolescent girls. Bar mitzvahs, obviously, that's if you're of Jewish faith. That happens at age 13. So it's a very important rite of passage. Anyways, some cultures really, these are really important things. As a whole, the US doesn't have any real rites of passage that, as a country, we have, parts of the country that do things like quinceanera or bar mitzvahs or, you know, specialized groups. But as a whole, we don't have like one thing like, oh, like, everyone in the States goes through this procedure when they get to a certain age. I mean, it's really, in some countries it's more important. In ours, it's not as much because we're a country that's made up of many different groups, different religious groups, different ethnicity groups, and so we don't have one standard. Okay, and that's going to end it for this first lecture from chapter 11.